All right, we're going to take a few minutes here and talk about stocker and feedlot cattle terminology, and then about some background and concepts about making money in the stocker and feedlot cattle business. And this will continue to be an introduction to these topics in the stocker and feedlot cattle management course. So let's first talk about terminology. I think it's important that we understand the terminology and all get on the same page. It's the language of the business, and so it's useful to know. An interesting thing about the cattle business is that the terminology is highly localized and it's pretty slangy. There's a lot of slang, and so I think it's important to know that. If we're looking at it from an academic perspective, from a science perspective, we need precision, and so it's great to have terms that we can define and that we all use the same terms and define everything the same way. But in the business world, in the actual production, that's not really the objective. That's not how things are done. And so understanding the terminology in the business and being able to be successful in the cattle business requires some credibility with other producers, and knowing their language certainly gives you some of that credibility. So we'll go over a little bit of that here today. So we've already talked a little bit about the different types of enterprises that you can have, but let's think about different types of enterprises that you can have in stocker production in the stocker industry. The first term that we've defined is that stockers mean that this is a stocker enterprise is a standalone enterprise using weaned calves. It's typically on grazed forages, and these calves are supplemented as needed. And I think this is kind of the preferred term in the southern United States for this activity. If you find somebody in Kansas and certainly in Oklahoma and Texas that's doing this activity, they're gonna refer to themselves as a stocker producer. A backgrounder is basically the same thing. It's kind of the same activity, but is maybe the preferred term in the northern United States, the northern plains and the Dakotas and places like that. In some cases, the term backgrounder can imply that we're using a little bit more of a confined environment and using more harvested forages rather than grazed forages. But I think in a lot of cases, it's pretty much the same activity. It's kind of a location thing, what you call it. A term that gets thrown around a lot in the industry is preconditioning, and at least in my opinion, preconditioning applies it implies that it is an add-on enterprise following weaning in a cow-calf enterprise. In preconditioning in this add-on period, it's when calves are prepped for the next owner. So a preconditioning program would be an add-on to a cow-calf system, typically lasting 45 to 60 days, where an owner would raise some calves and keep their own calves and develop them, prep them for either a stocker or a feedlot owner at the next phase. And then a receiving period or a receiving enterprise is kind of has a different connotation. And a receiving enterprise is the period when new cattle are brought into an operation and prepped for production. So this could be a stocker enterprise, or it could be a feedlot enterprise. But this receiving period is typically 30 to 45 days, and the cattle need to be closely monitored. They may be high risk in this phase. And so if you're either a stocker or a feedlot producer, if you buy preconditioned cattle that have been through a preconditioning program, then the receiving period that you're going to impose on them is shorter and it's easier, and you would expect the cattle to perform better in that receiving period. So I hope that clarifies a few of those kind of terms for you for different phases of the enterprises associated with stocker production. So let's do the same thing with feeder production. And a feeder is a standalone enterprise using weaned calves in confinement where they're fed a high grain diet. At the end of a feeder period, cattle are sold to a packer. Okay, and so there's some synonyms that are, I think, used a lot in the industry for this period. It's also called a finisher. It's also called a finishing period. It's the feed yard period, feed yard production. All those kind of terms refer to this activity. Feedlot, same thing. You'll hear the term dry lot a lot in the industry, and I think in many cases this is kind of what you're referring to. A lot of times you'll hear the term dry lot used if you have to confine cows and feed them in a confinement situation. You'll hear the term dry lot. So dry lot may be have the connotation of being a little bit more flexible and a little bit more general than some of these other terms. So let's talk a little bit about some hybrid enterprises that I think are fairly common. And if you certainly are in Oklahoma, you'll run into some of these kind of situations. Whether if you're working for an allied industry company or something like that, you'll run into some of these kind of situations. So a hybrid system might be a grow yard is the first one we could talk about. And in a grow yard, this is a dry lot that looks like and operates a lot like a feed yard, but is typically smaller. Many grow yards will have capacities between 500 and 2,000 or 3,000 head of capacity at one time. But they look like a feed yard, operate like a feed yard. They're just smaller. They focus on smaller cattle, on younger cattle. They may use more forages, more harvested forages, and typically they do not sell cattle to a packer, but they sell feeder cattle to a finishing yard. And so they're kind of an in-between and a hybrid step there. Grow yards may be a part of or may be affiliated with a larger traditional feed yard. Synonyms for this kind of operation could be a receiving yard, a starter yard, or a grower. Those kind of terms can imply this same kind of activity, and I think are synonyms. Here's a couple examples of what we might think about as a grow yard or a starter yard or those kind of things. You can see the example at the top here. We've got a fence line bunk that kind of looks like a feed yard, but it doesn't have quite the infrastructure that your traditional feed yard would have. And then here's another example in the bottom where we've got calves that are in confinement and have got a feed trough in the middle of the pen, and we start calves and grow calves this way. And typically you wouldn't see feed troughs in the middle of a feed yard pen like that. So kind of those are some different examples of what a grow yard or some of these different hybrid operations might look like. There's a few more that we could talk about for Oklahoma, and this is one that I think is quite common in Oklahoma, as I've noted here. And this is my term that I've kind of made up, and I call it a grass trap guy or a grass trap operation. And to me, this is a hybrid operation in which stockers and stocker cattle, usually lighter weight stockers, are stocked into small grass pastures, which are referred to as grass traps. And these calves are fed a relatively large amount of feed every day. So they're certainly in the pasture. There's a grass cover in the pasture, and at some times of the year, they graze the pasture, graze the grass that's there. Other times of the year, they're using the grass pasture as just a place to hold the cattle, and are hauling in most of the feed that those cattle get every day. So it's kind of flexible that way. The feed that is used in these operations is usually a blend of byproducts. So soybean hulls, corn gluten feed, distillers grains, stuff like that. Sometimes they may use grain products like corn. And the goal in these grass trap operations is to grow the cattle with as low a cost as possible. And that goes back to that flexibility. So they'll use the grass when it's available, and then use feed when the grass is not available, and try to be flexible on what kind of feed resource they use to achieve growing cattle as low a cost as possible. And like I said, this is pretty common in Oklahoma. So here are a couple examples of what, again, some more of what these operations might look like. Certainly here, the bottom picture might be a grass trap kind of operation where you got stockers in a small grass pasture and have a system where you can distribute a lot of feed to those cattle if you need to. So a couple more examples there. Let's talk about terminology around cattle types. And to start off with, I guess we could start with the term calf, and that is an immature bovine, and I think this term is used pretty loosely in the industry. So you'll hear people a lot of times say stocker calf or feeder calf, or you'll hear them say a load of calves, and those could be stocker calves or feeder calves or baby calves. That term calf is used pretty loosely. The term feeder is in the industry, as we kind of already talked about, is an animal that's ready to send to the feed yard. And so this kind of implies an animal that is in the neighborhood of, say, 650 pounds to 900 pounds in body weight, something like that. So kind of a larger stocker, an animal certainly that's ready to go to the feed yard. In government and in academia, the term feeder cattle just means weaned bovine. And you'll find that in most government reports and things like that, they don't use the term stocker cattle very much. They just call them feeder cattle. So everything that's weaned is kind of is called a feeder animal in government reports and different things like that. A yearling is an older immature bovine, so this implies that they've been weaned 3 to 5 months, and so they would be typically 12 to 14 months of age, something like that, and in the ballpark of that 650 to 900 pounds body weights in that ballpark. And then you'll hear the term long yearling, which is an even older bovine, and it implies they've been through a full stocker enterprise already. Typically, they're 800 pounds or larger. And so these are older cattle that have certainly already been through a stocker enterprise and probably are too old and too heavy to try to use as a stocker animal anymore. And these animals are certainly ready to go to the feed yard and probably need to go to the feed yard and be finished pretty expeditiously. Whoops. Finished cattle are cattle that have concluded a finishing period, so they have been in the feed yard and have completed a finishing period, and they are ready for slaughter for finished beef production. Okay, so a lot of terms for synonyms you'll hear for finished cattle are fat cattle or live cattle. Okay, so you'll hear those terms used a lot. Live cattle is used a lot in government reports. When we get to talking about risk management and you hear contracts, futures contracts, there's futures contracts on live cattle, so they use that terminology. But realize that live cattle means that they're finished cattle, they're fat cattle, they're ready for slaughter. So to kind of clarify this, you can remember that a feed yard buys feeder cattle and sells live cattle. If that helps you kind of remember what those terms are referring to. A few more extra terms here. Cutter bulls. You'll hear the term cutter bulls. These are basically heavy bull calves, or could be close to being yearling, almost yearling bulls. But heavy bull calves, say 650 to 950 pounds in body weight. And these cutter bulls are bought with the intention that they be castrated and then put on feed. And as you can imagine, this is kind of a high-risk enterprise. So cutter bulls implies that these calves are high risk, that they've possibly been mismanaged cattle that probably should already have been castrated by the previous owner, but for some reason they didn't do that, and so the previous owners lost some value. So these are mismanaged cattle that are bought at a discount and with the intention of the owner, the buyer of the cutter bulls, is going to take a risk and hope they can make some money on these kind of cattle. And then another term is a heiferette, and this is an animal. It's an old heifer, an older heifer, and this animal has possibly had one calf already, and then is put on feed for finished beef production. So this is kind of an interesting situation where you've got a female animal, a heifer that is older than just your typical heifer calf or yearling heifer, and they possibly have already produced one calf, but we're going to put them on feed and slaughter them, feed them grain, finish them, get them fat, and then slaughter them, and they produce typically produce acceptable quality beef. So this kind of gives you an idea of where heiferettes fall in the age range. So you could look at cattle that are less than 30 months of age. We refer to those as A maturity, and those are your typical feedlot cattle. And then heiferettes might be what we call B maturity. It would be between these cattle would be between 30 and 42 months of age. And then once you get past that heiferette category and older than 42 months, now these cattle would be called cows, and they've certainly got younger cows and older cows, but so the heiferette is kind of the transition between feedlot cattle, finishing cattle, and cows. So a few more cattle types that refer to some genetics and the breed types that cattle have. The first one that we'll talk about is English cattle. And these are cattle of predominantly English type breeds, which are Angus, Hereford, Shorthorn, those kind of breeds. These English cattle are typically expected to perform well, to grow well, and certainly to grade well. So that we typically think these kind of cattle would gain fat, would develop some body fat, and develop some marbling for beef production. And so that's one of the pros about English cattle is they should grade well. You'll hear the term blacks describing cattle, and these are cattle that are solid black hided and qualify for black hide programs. In a lot of cases, these are Angus cattle, but there are certainly other breeds that produce solid black hides, and so that's why you'll hear the term blacks instead of just saying Angus. But certainly a lot of black cattle are purebred Angus nearly. So that's that term. You'll hear the term exotics, and these are cattle of non-English breeding. So breeds that are continental breeds like Limousin, Charolais, Simmental, those kind of breeds. You'll hear the term crossbred, and in academia that means that any crossing of any two breeds, and in some cases could mean in the cattle industry could mean a cross between English and exotic breeding. But certainly in Oklahoma and Texas and kind of the Southern Plains, the term crossbred means that cattle have some amount of Bos indicus breeding or Brahman breeding that is visually evident. And so a synonym for crossbred might be an eared cattle. You'll hear the term, these cattle have some ear, and that means that they have some amount of Brahman breeding in them. And then the term northern cattle implies cattle from the northern United States, obviously, and typically implies a high percentage of Angus breeding or a high percentage of English breeding, and the ability to grade a high percentage choice. So northern cattle are typically share some traits with English and blacks and those kind of things that would indicate that they're going to have a lot of Angus breeding and marble really well. So some other terms, you may have heard the term Okies to describe calves, and these are traditionally this means an Angus by Hereford cross, but it could be any. This term could be used to describe any English breed crosses. Okies are desirable stocker and feeder cattle, but this term isn't used much anymore in the industry. It was kind of a little bit of an antiquated term now, maybe. You'll hear the term colored cattle. This is cattle that have color patterns and or body type that's indicative of non-beef breeding. So in many cases, this would be dairy cattle or cattle that have some evidence of dairy breeding or longhorn breeding. Native cattle can refer to cattle that originated from the local area. So, for instance, Oklahoma or a region of the state or that kind of thing. You'll hear the term smokes or smokies. These are cattle that are Angus by Charolais cross. They typically have gray hair and a gray nose, and that's where they get the term smoke or smoky from. And these are very desirable stocker and feeder cattle. These cattle perform really well and usually get a premium at the market. So we'll go through a couple examples of some of these. These are several different types of calves here. Just a good mix of stockers that you would see here, and they're showing you there's obviously black-hided here. There's a crossbred English. There's a straight-bred Charolais, and there's a couple smoke calves in this group here, and a black baldy. So it's kind of showing you some differences in the color patterns and the types, the terms you might use to describe these calves. Here's a set of calves in a feed yard that is just probably has some exotic or continental breeding to them. Several of the animals here. Here's some cattle that are colored. They're showing you some color patterns that are you might refer to as colored cattle. These cattle look like they have mostly beef breeding. Maybe some of these are belted Galloways, and that's where they're getting this colored pattern from. Here's a set of cattle that would be called crossbred cattle. As you can see, they have some Brahman influence. You can see why people might call these eared cattle. They have pretty large ears, and that's comes from the Brahman breeding that's in them. And so you can kind of see a set here that would be called crossbred cattle. And then here's a little pixelated picture, but these are some Jersey calves, Jersey crossbred calves, and these would be identified as probably not ideal beef breeding. Here's some little peewee calves. These would be referred to as Okies, kind of English crossbred kind of calves. Certainly little small stockers. And then here's another example of a colored calf. This one's got some longhorn breeding that's pretty evident from that color pattern. Pretty nice made little calf, but certainly has the color pattern indicative of longhorn breeding. So something to remember around cattle types is that some of the big players in the industry have their own terminology systems. So some large feeding companies, really large order buyers, those kind of outfits in the industry may have their own way of referring to different types of cattle. And if you're going to work for these enterprises or be an allied industry that sells to and works with some of these operations, it will behoove you to learn and understand their terminology systems. A few more cattle terms that will be important for you to understand. One is flesh. You'll hear people talk about flesh, and this is the amount of fat or condition that cattle are carrying. If calves are fleshy, this means that they have some fat, some body fat, and the presumption is that they won't gain exceptionally well in the future because they've already been on a good plane of nutrition for a period of time in order to gain the fat that they have. And so you shouldn't expect super efficient gain in the future on calves that are fleshy. And because of that, fleshy cattle will likely be discounted at the feed yard. Thin cattle are just the opposite. Thin cattle are cattle that aren't carrying a lot of fat, don't have, are in thin condition, and that would indicate that they've been on a low plane of nutrition prior to the time that you're seeing them as thin. And so if you provide these cattle a high plane of nutrition, they should gain really well and really efficiently for a period of time into the future, maybe the next 60 or 90 days. And that's why those cattle get a premium at the market. Another term that you'll hear, especially around marketing, is fill, the amount of fill that cattle have, and this is the amount of gut contents that cattle are carrying. If cattle are held off of feed and water, they will lose gut fill. This is called shrink. They'll shrink. And just as you can imagine, if you didn't eat or drink for a day, you would certainly lose some weight, but most of that would be gut fill. And so these cattle that are shrunk will not weigh as much as they typically would, and the buyer has to pay for less weight. And so this is why cattle that are shrunk will typically get a little bit of a premium at the market, because it is easy and cheap to add that weight back to the cattle just by offering them feed and water. They'll regain that fill really rapidly and at low cost. So, fill is something to understand and something to manage when you're buying and selling cattle. You don't want to get on the wrong end of the transaction of cattle that either have an excessive amount of fill, which is kind of referred to as tanked in the industry. You don't want them to have a lot of fill, and you don't want them to be super shrunk and have very little fill and be on the wrong end of a transaction. So here's a couple of examples of some more cattle. These cattle are in good condition for stockers. I wouldn't necessarily call them thin, but they're certainly not fleshy either. But these cattle are in average condition or good condition for stocker cattle. These cattle here are probably been on pasture for a longer period of time and are carrying a little bit more flesh and a little more condition than the cattle before. And I think you can see that on them. So when is a calf a stocker versus a feeder? And this is a hard question to answer all the time, but let's talk through the prototypical beef production system, which is a yearling system. Okay, so in this system, calves are born, and then about 7 months later, they're weaned, and they weigh about 500 pounds when they're weaned. They go through a stocker phase after that for maybe 5 months or so and gain 250 pounds, so that when you put them into a feed yard, they're almost a year old. They weigh about 750 pounds. They go into the finishing period, and that lasts maybe 5 months, and they'll gain maybe 600 pounds in that time period. And so you'll slaughter those cattle at 16 months of age, weighing 1,350 pounds. That would kind of be a prototypical or expected system, yearling production system for the beef production chain. Another example would be the prototypical calf-fed system, where you have calves that are born, they're weaned at that 7 months of age. They might be a little older or a little heavier, say 600 pounds, and they go directly into the feed yard, kind of skip the stocker phase. And this is why they're called calf feds, because they go directly into the feed yard right after weaning. And they're in the feed yard maybe 6 months, gain 700 pounds or so, and will slaughter at 13 months of age at 1,300 pounds. So that's kind of a prototype calf fed system. Okay, so in actual beef production systems in the real world, there is a huge amount of variation. You'll see a lot of operations that follow very closely to those prototypes that we just showed you, but you'll also see operations that vary widely from those prototypes. So there's in the real world, there's a huge amount of variation. The actual production systems depend on the forage, on the climate, on markets, on objectives of different managers, just a lot of factors that cause management decisions to be made that that change how those production systems work. Something to realize is that it is biologically possible to put a 200-pound calf on feed in a feed yard. That can be done. It's possible. It is also biologically possible to finish a 1,400-pound steer so that it will grade choice on grass and without ever putting it in a feed yard. That's biologically possible. But in both of those scenarios require a pretty special manager to make that successful, and certainly to make that a successful business in either of those scenarios. So I kind of say that to illustrate there is huge. You will see huge variation in the real world, and it's possible. Cattle are really adaptable. It's possible to do a lot of different kinds of production systems. But the further you get from those prototype systems, the more management and the more attention you're going to have to pay to making sure that the cattle have what they need to perform well, and certainly making the right decisions so that you have a chance at making some money. And so with that, let's get into talking about making money in the stocker and feedlot cattle business. And these will be just some basic concepts that we'll use throughout the semester to understand and evaluate decisions that we can make. Okay, so just I guess the first thing to realize is money is not the most important thing in the world. Love is. And fortunately, I love money, so it works out so that we can spend some time and effort thinking about making money. So the 4 keys to making money in the stocker and feedlot cattle business is to buy low, sell high, keep them alive, and make them gain. And if you do those 4 things, you're going to stand a really good chance of making money. So we're going to spend most of the semester talking about these 4 things. We're going to spend the first part of the semester talking about animal health, and that's essentially keeping them alive. And then we're going to spend some time talking about nutrition, and that's kind of that piece of making them gain. And then at the end of the semester, we're going to talk about economics and risk management, and that's the piece about buying low and selling high. And so I want to just give you an introduction to buy low and sell high right now, so that you kind of have a framework as you're going through the semester, and we'll get into some more details at the end of the semester. But it's important to understand where we're headed to start with. Okay, so a couple things to understand about the stocker and feedlot business that's different from the cow-calf business. If you think about the cow-calf business and cow-calf operations, this is a manufacturing business. You should think of it kind of like a manufacturing type of business. Okay, so the way that you make money in the cow-calf business is that you produce calves for less than the cost of the inputs. So your land, your labor, your feed, your vet, all those kind of inputs, the goal is to produce calves for less than what those inputs cost. And so in the cow-calf business, you're really mostly more concerned about controlling costs. That's really the way that you're going to be able to influence how much profit you make. Okay? And in the cow-calf business, typically over the long run, we have observed that the cow-calf business is less risky. There's less risk in the cow-calf business. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's more or less profitable over the long run, but it just means that there's less risk. And so let's contrast that with the stocker and feedlot cattle business. And you should probably think more about this as a merchandising business. Okay, so rather than making the products, you're kind of going to be the business that's going to resell them. So it's kind of the Walmart of the world. So stockers and feeders are a merchandising business. It's a margin business. Okay. And so the way that you make money is to add value to the animals that you buy, intending to resell them. So you're gonna purchase animals for resale. You're gonna buy the animal with the intention of reselling them, and you're gonna add value to that animal, and that's where your profit's gonna come from. Okay, so you're certainly concerned about the costs of what it takes to do that, but you're probably more concerned about the margin, about how much value you can add to these animals. And you're probably more concerned about the margin in the stocker and feeder industry than you are in the cow-calf industry, for sure. And over time, it's relatively more risk in the stocker and feeder than in cow-calf. Maybe there's more potential for profit, but there's more risk. So in stockers and feeders, the buy-sell ratio is important. So we just talked about that you're going to buy calves for resale, and so the price that you buy them at and the price that you sell them at, and the ratio of those two prices is really important. We use a couple of ways of trying to do some math to help us understand what those ratios are. One of them is the cost of gain, and one of them is the value of gain. And these two concepts, I think, are really critical to understanding how to evaluate the profitability of a stocker and feedlot enterprise. So let's go through cost of gain and then value of gain really quickly, and then we'll finish up this talk talking about some of the implications of value of gain. So let's first off talk about cost of gain, okay? And so we'll get started here just by calculating gain on any animal. So this cost of gain number, we're gonna figure out how much it costs to produce the gain, that the body weight gain that we add to these animals. And so certainly gain's easy to calculate if you take the final body weight, whatever you sell the cattle, the weight you sell the cattle at, subtract the weight that you purchased them at, and so the difference is gain. Okay, so if you were to buy a 550-pound steer in November, grazing on wheat for 140 days, and then sell that steer when he weighed 915 pounds, it's easy to calculate the gain. 915 minus 550. That calf gained 365 pounds while you owned him. So that was your gain. So let's say that the cost of production in your enterprise, and this could include pasture, feed, vet, interest, labor, overhead, machinery repairs, any taxes, any of those kind of things, any of those costs. You should calculate what those costs are. And let's say that they add up to, in this example, $192 per steer. Okay, so here's how we're going to calculate the cost of gain. We're going to take that $192 of cost and divide by the 365 pounds of gain, and so our cost of gain comes out to be 0.526, or about 53 cents per pound. Okay, so we know, now we've calculated, we know that in this enterprise, in this example, it costs about 53 cents to add a pound of gain to these steers. And that number is really critical for each enterprise to know. Okay, so let's put a pin in that. We figured our cost of gain at about 53 cents per pound. Okay, so now let's think about the value of gain. We know what the gain cost. We know what it cost us to put that gain on the animal. But now the question is, what is that gain worth? How much is the market willing to give us for that gain? Or how much value have we added to the animal? Okay, and so let's think about the value of gain. And it's pretty similar to cost of gain. It's just using the values. So to figure the value of gain, the formula is to take the value of the animal when you sell it, or how much money you sell the animal for, subtract out how much money you paid for the animal, and then divide by the amount of gain. And that little formula is going to give you the value of gain. It's going to tell you what the market thinks the gain that you added is worth. Okay, so let's go through our example again to solidify this. We've got, let's say we buy a 550-pound steer at $155, and so to clarify here, this is $155 per hundredweight, which is the same thing as $1.55 per pound. Okay, so we're going to buy a 550-pound steer at $155 per hundredweight. In November, we're going to graze him on wheat for 140 days, and then we're going to sell a 915-pound steer at $130 a hundredweight, which again is the same thing as $1.30 per pound. Okay, so let's do this math here. If we're going to do the value gain, we first have to calculate the selling value, the amount of money we sold the steer for. So that's that 915 pounds times $1.30 per pound. And then we're going to subtract off the value, the price that we paid for the steer. And that's 550 pounds times $1.55. So this is when we bought the steer. We bought a 550-pound steer at $1.55, and so that's our buy value or our purchase cost right there. So in this example, our sell value was $1,189.50. This is what we sold the steer for. We had to pay, when we bought that steer, we paid $852.50 for that steer when we bought it. And so the value that we've added to this steer is $337. So we added $337 worth of value to this steer by owning him and growing him for the time period that we did. Okay, so let's look at value of gain. We know this is the value that we added, $337, and all we have to do is divide that by the gain. So again, that's 915 pounds minus 550 pounds. We calculated that gain earlier. It's 365 pounds of gain right there. So our value of gain was 92 cents per pound. Okay, so you can see here we got a value of gain of 92 cents per pound. The market told us that each pound that we added to those cattle was worth 92 cents, and it only cost us 53 cents to add those pounds, right? So we made a profit on every pound that we added to this animal. We made a profit of about 40 cents. And so this operation we could use this method to understand that these cattle were profitable and calculate the profit that we made. So if that was confusing or was brand new to you, the value of gain calculations, I'd encourage you to go back through the video, watch it a time or two again, do a couple of practice problems, look at some market reports from a sale barn, and figure out how that value of gain calculation works. You can certainly go on Google and just Google value of gain cattle, and you'll find several fact sheets and resources to help you go through it, explain it a little bit different than I did, and see if you can understand that calculation. But it's a pretty important concept that you should get locked down on. And this is a really good discussion here from Dr. Peel at Oklahoma State University, talking about some of the trends that are happening in value of gain. And I think if you read this little article, it'll motivate you to understand why value of gain is so important, and help you get some practice on calculating it and understanding what you can do with it. So we already talked about profit just a minute ago, but the profit, you can kind of see the profit equation here. One way to calculate profit, and a good way to calculate profit in stocker and feeders, is to look at the value of gain minus the cost of gain, and so that's your margin on each pound of gain, and then multiply that by the amount of gain that you got, and that little equation will tell you the profit that you made on each animal. Okay, so something to think about and understand here, and this kind of goes back to the discussion of stockers being a margin business. What kind of becomes apparent to you as you study this is that the cost of the original 550-pound steer isn't really very important. It doesn't really matter in the long run. It doesn't really matter what that 550-pound steer cost. What you are really concerned about is how much margin you added to that steer, how much value you added to the steer. Its base cost doesn't really matter. It's all in the value that you add, and so that's the margin. That's why this is a margin business. And so why is that important, or why is that true? And another way to think about that is that you bought that 550 pound steer, but realize that you're going to sell those same 550 pounds back into the market. Okay, so that's why the cost doesn't really matter so much. You bought them from the market, and you're going to sell them back into the market. Okay, the thing that you're going to do is you're going to sell the 550 pounds of steer that you bought. You're going to sell it back, but you're also going to sell it back with 365 more pounds that you added. And so the important part is, what's the value of those 365 pounds that you added? Because the 550 pounds that you bought, it doesn't really matter what they cost, because you're going to sell those back into the market. So again, that's kind of the margin thing. So what's important is the value of the pounds that you add, and what it costs you to add those pounds. So I think that's pretty good, and certainly useful. One last topic here I want to go through is this topic, a concept of rollback, or price rollback in cattle. And this is a little bit confusing topic for people that aren't familiar with the cattle industry and don't have a lot of experience in the cattle industry. This rollback concept is kind of a new thing. So I want to go through that for you. So rollback is related to the fact that if you go look at a cattle price report from a sale barn or anything like that, it will become obvious to you that lighter cattle sell for a higher price per pound than heavier cattle. As cattle get heavier, the price per pound goes down. Okay, and that's rollback. And so you can calculate the amount of rollback just by taking the selling price per pound and subtracting the purchase price per pound. So I don't know if I've got an example coming here. Yeah, I've got a good one. Okay, so same example that we had before. So we're going to buy this 550 pound steer at $1.55 per pound. Okay, so our purchase price per pound is $1.55 per pound. Okay, and then we're going to sell that 950 pound steer at $1.30 per pound. So our selling price per pound is this $1.30 right here. Okay, so our rollback is 155 minus 130. So in this example, we've got 25 cents per pound rollback in the price of these cattle. Okay, and so that shows you again what I said before, that as cattle get heavier, the price per pound goes down. Okay, and so the important thing to understand about rollback that impacts the profit equation a little bit, or profit evaluation, is that you sell those original 550 pounds back into the market. Remember, we talked about you're going to buy these 550 pounds right here, and you're going to sell them back into the market later. Those same 550 pounds, you're going to sell back into the market, right? But the issue with rollback is that you're going to sell those original 550 pounds for 25 cents per pound less than you bought them for. Right? So those original 550 pounds that you bought, when you sell them back, you're not going to get as much money for them when you sell them back. And that phenomenon is called rollback. And so that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. So realize that those original 550 pounds are worth $137.50 less when you sell them than they were when you bought them. Okay, and so part of the value that you add to the cattle, because of the weight that you added, the value that you have is going to have to overcome this rollback where these original 550 pounds that you bought are kind of devalued. Okay, so you got you kind of when you add the weight to these 550 pounds, that extra weight has to have enough value to overcome this $137.50 loss, because these 550 pounds aren't worth as much as they were when you bought the cattle. So you might ask, why does that have to happen? And there's a biological reason that that has to happen. And so I'll try to explain that to you, hopefully, so that you can understand why this rollback happens. Okay, and I think this is the biological reason that this has to happen. Very young and lightweight cattle are expensive to produce, right? And why are they expensive to produce? Well, baby calves require cows to produce them and make them grow. So um, baby calves, you have to have a cow to make a baby calf, and you need a cow to raise a baby calf. Okay, so baby calves, or when they're born, they weigh 80 or 100 pounds, but it takes a lot of expense to produce one of those. And they have a lot of potential for growth in the future. So they only weigh 100 pounds, but they have the potential to grow to 1,300 pounds or 1,400 pounds before we're going to slaughter them. So they have a lot of potential growth in front of them. Okay, so the fact that they're very expensive to produce and that they have a lot of potential growth makes them worth a lot per pound, right? Those calves. Baby calves, when they're brand new, they're worth a lot per pound, because they have all that potential growth, and they don't weigh very much. So per pound, they're worth a whole lot. Okay, and then contrast that to if that baby calf were to grow up and be a weaned calf. Weaned calves don't require expensive cows anymore, right? They just need a source of feed to grow. So it doesn't cost as much to add weight and raise and produce calves once they're already weaned. It doesn't cost as much to produce them as it does baby calves. You just need to provide them feed. You don't have to have expensive cows to keep raising them. So weaned calves are cheaper to add pounds to than a baby calf is. So that makes them worth less per pound than a baby calf, right? And so so you can kind of see here how this, as calves get heavier, the price per pound is going down because of these biological facts of what it takes to produce them. So adding pounds to a calf uses up the potential growth of these small calves. Another way to think about that is that adding pounds dilutes that expensive small calf that's there with more pounds. And so that's the reason that you see this rollback happen, and as calves get bigger, the price per pound comes down. Okay. So how much rollback can you expect, or what's normal? Well, there's maybe not a normal. The amount of rollback is highly dynamic and it's really variable, and the amount of rollback is determined by the market, and it depends on the availability of cattle. It depends on feed cost. It depends on grass conditions. It depends on feedlot capacity, and it depends on people's opinions and projections of what all these things are going to be 1 to 6 months into the future. So you can see there's a whole lot of factors that go into what people think it's going to cost, and what the value of these different weights of calves would be. And so that's where rollback is determined, and that's the reason that rollback can be highly dynamic, highly variable from any one point in time to another. So to review here, we've got value of gain is the added value of the gain that you put on a calf. Okay, the value of gain should always be less than the selling price. So this is important. Okay, if you think about in our example, we sold a 915 pound steer and the selling price of that steer was $1.30 per pound. Okay, so the value of gain almost never is as high as the selling price is. So the value of gain, what the market thinks the value that you've added to the calf is never as high as the selling price. It should always be lower than the selling price. Okay, and the reason that it should always be lower than the selling price is rollback. It's because there's almost always rollback in the cattle price structure, because you buy an expensive smaller calf and then you have to sell that smaller calf back into the market at a lower price because you've added some more pounds to it. Okay, so rollback, that's what that is. So that's something to always remember when you're evaluating profit. If you're trying to evaluate how much is the weight that I'm going to add to these cattle, how much is that weight worth, it's almost never the right answer to say that it's worth the selling price. What the gain that you add, the weight that you add to cattle, is almost always worth less than the selling price. The value of the gain is almost always less than the selling price. So that's something you certainly want to remember. Okay, so homework from this long video is to go through and think about what's the value of gain of steers right now at your favorite sale barn. You can go on their website, look at a sale barn report, and calculate the value of gain of some different weights of steers. Okay, another thing to think about is how much difference is there between the cost of gain and the break-even value of gain in different environments, different enterprises, different scenarios. If you're not familiar with the term break-even, that's you could Google that too, but the term break-even is referring to where profit is zero. And so if profit is zero, then the question is, how much difference is there between cost of gain and value of gain if profit is zero? And so that's something to think about, and you can kind of work and figure that out, and that'll help you solidify some of the concepts of value of gain and cost of gain. So thanks for listening to this super long video. Go back and watch any part of it that you need to, and we'll see you in class.